الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد ومع بعد قال الله في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم إن في ذلك لآية للعالمين صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh upon all of you here. I'd like to begin not only by wishing all of you peace, but giving my condolences to the individuals here who recently lost someone in their family. I bless, inshallah, they reach the highest levels of Jannah. Today, my topic is the science of Quran recitation. So the ayah of the Quran that I just read, which is Surat Rum, in English reads, "And of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the differences in your languages and in your colors. Surely in that is a sign for the world." And so one of the things that as Muslims we believe is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created differences in our languages, and that's something that is beautiful about us as human beings, right? We also believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us into different nations and tribes so we may come to know one another. And so part of a way to do that is to learn each other's languages. Another very beautiful thing though about Islam is that our book is in one language that is preserved across all nations. It doesn't matter what your mother tongue is. You have access to the original text, the original Holy Quran in its original language without any bias or change through interpreters. So today what I'm going to talk about is how we Muslimin, people who don't necessarily grow up constantly, in an environment constantly hearing the Quran here in the United States, how can we overcome certain challenges that make it difficult to recite the Quran? And what I've done is I have taken research conducted by speech-language pathologists. So who here is familiar with speech pathology or what speech pathologists do? No one. Awesome. Except my husband. Okay. So speech pathology is basically the study of the biological aspects of speech, right? So they study the voice box, the respiratory system, the articulation system. They study the tongue and how it moves and how physically we produce sound. And at the same time, speech pathologists also study sort of the humanities side of language. They study grammar and linguistics. They cover semantics, how language is used. And then this information often gets used by speech pathologists to help people who have difficulty speaking. So for example, if someone has a stroke and loses the ability to speak, or if someone has an injury and has damage to, say, their voice box or has difficulty breathing, right? A speech pathologist is someone who can help them learn to speak again. Another thing speech pathologists can do is if someone has learned English as a second language, they can go to a speech pathologist to get help to reduce their accent, right? So if someone for some reason wants to speak English more like a native speaker here in the US, a speech pathologist is someone who can help you do that. And so what I've done is I've taken research conducted in this field, and I've seen a lot of answers to questions, a lot of the problems that students of the Quran will have, and potential answers and potential solutions to make reciting the Quran easier. So if we could turn to my next slide here. Okay. So some of the questions that I'm hoping to answer for people today is, why is it so hard to pronounce many of the sounds of Arabic, right? Why do we frequently make errors when we're reading, right? How come when we're looking, at a word right in front of our face, why will we sometimes miss letters or mispronounce letters, right? And why is it often challenging to understand the Quran when reading it? So for people who have studied Arabic, feel like they understand the language well, yet when they're reciting the Quran, they'll just read it and have no idea what they said. Why is that? And what are things we can do to make it easier? So before I jump into that, I want to give just a little bit more background information about what exactly I'm talking about. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is when I talk about Arabic, what am I talking about? So for many people here, you're already going to be familiar. Arabic, there's no such thing as one Arabic, right? And if you go to the Arab world, right, you're going to find many people there speaking very many different dialects, many different versions of Arabic that vary greatly from the Quran, right? So has anyone here had the experience of learning to read the Quran, learning the Arabic of the Quran, and then trying to use that to talk to an Arab today? Has anyone done that? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's the equivalent of reading William Shakespeare, right, and studying William Shakespeare, and then trying to come to somebody in the US or Britain today and have a conversation. And frankly, it sounds quite ridiculous. And so there's different levels, different varieties of Arabic. What I'm going to be talking about today is strictly Quranic Arabic. So this is the classical Arabic, the Arabic that was spoken in the Prophet's time in Mecca almost 1,400 years ago, okay? There's different versions though. There's what's called modern standard Arabic, which is what Arabs in different countries who speak different dialects use to communicate with each other. It's what's used in their media, but that's not what we're going to be talking about today. And then also spoken Arabic. So spoken Arabic, again, is very, very, very different from Quranic Arabic. And there's often a misconception in our communities. People think that if they are not an Arab, they are not going to be able to recite the Quran correctly. And then conversely, people will think that just because someone is an Arab, they can recite the Quran correctly. And that is completely false. So these dialects of Arabic, right, will not use some of the sounds that the Quran uses. So for example, the letter Qaf in Egypt and in Lebanon, they don't use the letter Qaf. They replace it with the Hamza sound. And you'll meet a lot of Arabs who have difficulty pronouncing Qaf and pronouncing a lot of these other letters and other sounds that exist in the Quran. So anybody around the world can learn to read the Quran properly, and everybody, no matter where you're from, has to go to school and has to learn how. Not one nation has necessarily a big advantage over another one. The next thing I want to talk about are different levels of Quran recitation, right? So again, when I'm talking about Quran recitation, what am I talking about? And I'd like to compare Quran recitation to a wedding cake. So here we have this beautiful wedding cake, and at the top we have this beautiful decoration. A lot of people, they're going to focus at the pretty part at the top. So the pretty part at the top represents Quranic tones, using your beautiful voice and reciting in this sing-songy way. And a lot of times when people recite, they'll focus on the voice. So when they're trying to recite, they'll focus so much on using a nice voice, they forget about the other layers, right? So reciting the Quran also implements tajweed. I have this, my middle layer here. These are the rules of beautification. There are rules about how to do this. You can't just stretch stuff randomly because you think it sounds nice. There's a process. And then the base layer, the most important layer, is accuracy. Reading the letters that are actually on the page where they're supposed to be, and correct pronunciation. So using the letters that you are supposed to say, using the correct sounds. So today I'm strictly going to talk about the bottom layer because it's the most important. So without it, your cake is gone, splat. Doesn't matter that you have a pretty part on top, right? And this layer, right, takes a lot of work. A lot of people think, well, that's so easy, reading Arabic, it's not hard at all. I can focus on this layer, and that's not true at all. There's a lot of work and a lot of study students have to go through. So this is what we're going to talk about. So the first category here that I'm going to talk about is phonology, which, if I could get to my next slide, thank you. Phonology refers to sounds, right? The sounds that are within a language. And the phonology of Arabic, right? Arabic has its own specific sounds. The Quran has its own specific sounds that don't exist in other languages. And mispronunciation of sounds in Arabic can cause a drastic change in meaning, right? So, for example, we have two words in Arabic. We have qalb and we have kalb. Qalb means heart. Kalb means dog. But for a lot of people, the letter qaf will accidentally be produced like ka. People will say kalb when they mean to say qalb. And what you could end up saying when you're reading the Quran is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in your dog instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in your heart. So that can be a very drastic change in meaning. It's important to know how to produce these things correctly. So why is this, right? So why is it that it's so hard to produce these sounds for some people? And why is it so hard even for people to hear the difference between these sounds? Well, this is why. So babies are able, when they're first born, they are able to perceive all sounds in all languages. They're able to hear the difference between sounds and pick up on very, very specific differences between sounds. And this is something that aids them in their language development. It helps them to be able to learn their mother tongue. But what happens is the more and more that they hear their language spoken around them, their mother tongue spoken around them, that ability disappears. And they go through what's called perceptual narrowing, right? So perceptual narrowing refers to just their perception of these different sounds becoming more narrow, becoming more specific. And it's harder then to differentiate different sounds of different languages because now they're focused on their mother tongue. And this is a natural process that occurs. And so that's why as adults, sometimes when we listen to some of the sounds of Arabic, we can't even hear the difference between some of them. So I'd actually like next to run just a quick experiment on the audience. So I have two words here on the board. I'm going to read both of these words two different ways. And then I'm going to ask you which one you think was correct, or if you can't even hear the difference at all, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. So for the first word, Ida, Iza. Who thinks that the first way was the correct way to say that word? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. Okay. Who thinks that the second way was the correct way? Who could not even hear the difference? Who did it sound the same? One person. Okay, perfect. That's okay. That's all right. Second word. Adam, Adam. Who thinks the first way was the correct way? 1, 2. Who thinks the second way was the correct way? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I see a lot of hands not raised up at all. Who could not hear the difference? One person could not hear the difference. That's okay, right? So that's a normal part of phonological development, right? Sometimes you're not going to be able to hear the differences between sounds. So on that point, there's a misconception regarding language learning a lot of people have. A lot of people think that if you do not learn these sounds when you are a baby, or if you do not learn a language when you are very, very young, you never, ever can. That you're stuck and you're not going to have the ability to do that. That is completely false. And I'm going to talk about later in the presentation things that you can do. Next. Okay. The next thing that a lot of people will struggle to understand and a complaint and a frustration of a lot of even Quran teachers is sometimes people will have the ability to hear a sound, right? But then they can't produce it. Or for example, sometimes they'll be able to produce a sound. If their teacher says it to them, they'll be able to say it back. So for example, if your teacher says alam, the student will be able to say alam back, but then when they're reading, they'll say alam. They'll say the word incorrectly, right? And so why is this? And this is just, again, it's another part of natural development, phonological development. This is called stimulability, which means it's a point someone gets to where when there's some sort of external stimulus, they're able to produce the sound correctly, but they still might struggle to do it when they're trying to produce this sound on their own. And this is a really good sign. That means that you're on your way to be able to make this sound correctly. Phoneme production, right? So again, right, a lot of Quran teachers will notice sometimes, right, they can say when they're reading their text, right? So sometimes, so I've covered people who can't hear the sound. People who can say a sound, you know, in isolation when they repeat it back, but not by themselves. And then there's sometimes people, when they're reading the Quran, sometimes they'll be able to produce the sound correctly when they're reading it. Other times they're not going to be able to produce the qaf or the ayn or these tricky letters. And so why is this? Again, this is just another part of the stages of phonological development. So it's not unusual. So for example, in studies of children who are experiencing delays in their phonological development, it's not unusual for them to be able to pronounce a sound at the beginning of a word, but not be able to pronounce it at the end, or not be able to pronounce it at the middle. And so sometimes the word placement of a specific sound affects how easily someone can produce it. And again, that's okay. So if you're getting it sometimes, that means you're on your way. And with practice, eventually, you know, inshallah, you'll be able to produce it at all levels. Another reason why people will struggle with the sounds of Arabic is because of the influence of one's mother tongue. So sounds that don't exist in one's mother tongue are going to be hard to produce, right? So even if you can hear them, it can be quite challenging to produce these sounds. So there's a couple reasons for this outside of just regular development, right, outside of just hearing. There's another concept that might affect being able to produce sounds that comes from a mother language, and that regards the rules of how to put sounds together. So when we learn our languages, we don't just learn individual sounds. Each language has rules for how these sounds are put together, and these are called phonotactic rules. So for example, the majority of the audience here are Farsi speakers. So English and Farsi both have the S sound, the equivalent of the letter S or letter C. English and Farsi both have the K sound, which is K or kaf. But English and Farsi have different rules about how you put these two sounds together. So in English, you can put the S and the K together at the beginning of a word, no problem. But in Farsi, if a S starts at a word, a vowel has to follow it, right? As the vowel doesn't follow it, Persian speakers will normally put a vowel in front of it. And so that's the reason why, even though both Americans, both English speakers and Farsi speakers can say S and K, why English speakers can say school, but a lot of Persian speakers will say a school. Why? Because Persian and English have different rules about how sounds are put together. So this is again something that contributes to difficulties in reading the Quran correctly. So solutions, what can we do? So the first thing that we've learned is that all this is just a normal part of development. A lot of times when people are trying to read the Quran and they're really struggling with just these very sounds, they'll get down on themselves, they'll think that they can't do it, they'll think that they're not trying hard enough, and none of that is true, right? It's normal to make these mistakes. It's normal to sometimes make a sound and sometimes not make a sound. It doesn't mean you're dumb. It doesn't mean you're not working hard enough. It just means you're at a different phase of developing these sounds, and that's okay. So what can we do to be able to fully acquire these sounds correctly? The number one thing is listening, right? And this is something that speech pathologists will do when they work with people on reducing their accents, is they will have them listen a great deal to some of these sounds that they don't know. And so what we as Muslims can do first and foremost is listen to the Quran regularly. Another thing that speech pathologists will do when they work with people on accent reduction is teach them about the sounds, right? Teach them about the differences between the language they're trying to speak more correctly and their mother tongue. And just learning the details about these differences of sound can help a lot for adults, right? To be able to know what to do and how to produce these sounds correctly. And finally, having someone correct you. So again, speech pathologists, when they work with a client, they'll correct them and they'll say, and through continual correction, eventually their clients will get it. And so for us, it's very important to have a Quran teacher, to have someone listen to you recite the Quran and correct you. And this can sometimes be a frustrating process. This sometimes might make someone feel embarrassed that someone hears what their mistakes are. But really, subhanAllah, this is an excellent way to learn to recite the Quran correctly. And if we understand this is all normal, then there's no reason to be embarrassed. The one thing that I do want to mention, talking about listening, right, as absolutely number one, what everyone should be doing if they want to recite the Quran properly, listening, is first and foremost, listen to Sheikh Khalil al-Husri, right? This Sheikh, his recitation, he doesn't use a lot of the fancy tones and things like that. He recites more with a soft, sing-songy kindness, but it's more very clear articulation of all the words. And the reason why it's important to him goes back into my cake example. Because if you listen to reciters who use these beautiful voices, you're going to focus so much on the pretty part on the top of the cake that you're going to miss that base layer that you need. So absolutely listen to Shaykh Khalil al-Husri. This is also agreed upon by some of the best Quran reciters in the world. If you ask them who to listen to, they're going to say listen to Khalil al-Husri. Maulana Abu Zar Wahidi, he's hands down one of the best qaris anywhere in the world. We're very lucky to have him in the Bay Area in California. And even he will tell his students not to listen to his recitation as their teacher. He will tell them listen to Khalil al-Husri. So this is the guy that you want to listen to. And here I have an example of a makharij chart, a chart of where the sounds in Arabic are produced. So there's a lot of charts out there that show you where to put your tongue to make sounds of Arabic. There's a lot of YouTube videos that show you how to move your tongue and how to move your mouth. And so there's a lot of resources out there for adults who want to learn how to produce these sounds correctly. So the next dimension I'm going to talk about, now that we finished just about phonemes, we just talked about producing sounds. Now I want to talk about overall reading, right? What are some of the challenges about reading as a whole rather than making specific sounds? So common struggles people will have is they'll wonder, why is it that I am missing vowel markings or missing whole letters? Aren't I looking at the page? Why is it that I don't see the dhamma and the fatha and the ta? People will sometimes put in words that are entirely different from what is in the text. So accidentally insert a word that's not even there. Why do we do that? Why, for example, we mix up ayahs that are similar to each other? And here's some research that might point to why. So the first thing that researchers have found when they've studied children is that there are 5 stages of reading. And the initial stages cover a process that is called decoding. And what decoding just refers to is the process of associating a symbol with a sound and then producing it orally correctly. So when children, for example, when children will sound out words, right, that's a process of decoding. And this is something that can take time. And so as you're reading, right, if you make a mistake and you miss a letter, or if you pronounce a letter a wrong way, even though you know how to make the sound, this is just you in the process of decoding. You're at an earlier reading level. Common errors that will occur when people are decoding are, 1, missing letters or markings, right? So it's very easy to miss a letter, miss a marking. But as you read and as you practice, your ability to pay attention to the detail is going to improve. Another thing people sometimes will do is they will decode according to the rules of their mother tongue. And this is something that mostly applies to people who speak languages that use the Arabic alphabet. So for example, like in Farsi, a great many of the letters in a great many of the Arabic letters in Farsi will make the z sound. But when you're reading the Quran, there is only one letter in the whole alphabet that makes that z sound, and everything else makes a completely different sound. And so even though I know a lot of Persian speakers who do know how to produce these sounds correctly, maybe out of habit, they might be saying z in places where actually in the Quran there is no z. A couple interesting mistakes that often will be made during the decoding stage. One is substituting words that look similar. So you'll see, for example, children, if they read the sentence, the dog is big, that's what the text is, they might accidentally say, the dog is bit. Why? Because big and bit look visually similar. And so as they're decoding, they'll make that mistake. In Arabic, I have an example. So I have the word hadi, which refers to the sacrifice that we make on Eid al-Adha, and huda, guidance. So these are 2 completely different words with very different meanings, but they look similar, right? And so it's not uncommon when students are reading the Quran to accidentally say a different word that they already know that looks similar. And again, that's just a normal part of the reading process. It's not because you're dumb, it's not because you're not working hard enough, you're just still decoding, you're in the decoding stage. Another interesting mistake that will often be made in the decoding stage is switching out words that are similar in meaning. So again, using the same example, the dog is big, researchers have seen the child, instead of reading the dog is big, will say the dog is huge. Why? Because huge and big are very similar in meaning, and huge isn't written on the page, but it's a common mistake that happens in this stage of reading. So for example, I have an ard. So, taking from Ayat al-Kursi, وَسِعَ كُرْسِيهُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, right? His throne encompasses the earth, the heavens, and the earth and ard. But it wouldn't be strange at all for a Quran student to maybe accidentally read وَسِعَ كُرْسِيهُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالدُّنْيَا. His throne encompasses the heavens, and dunya also means earth, the world, right? But it's a different word. So again, it's important to make sure we're being accurate when we're reading the Quran, that we're using the correct words in the Quran. But if you accidentally make mistakes like this, it's not because you're bad, it's not because you're dumb, it's just because you're still in the decoding stage. And with practice, you'll get past this, and these mistakes will reduce. Reading comprehension. So again, this applies to people who are reading the Quran who already know a great deal of Arabic. Sometimes Quran students who already have studied Arabic a great deal, or maybe may speak a language that has a lot of words in common with Arabic, When they're reading and they'll read a page of the Quran, they'll just read it and have no idea what was on the page, yet they know so many words. And this can be frustrating for students and even frustrating for teachers. But again, this is a normal part of reading development. So earlier I mentioned there are 5 stages of reading. The earlier stages cover decoding, and it's not until the stage 3 of reading when researchers have seen that children begin to transition from learning to read, from reading to learn, and actually being able to really comprehend what it is that they're reading. So it's just a normal part of learning to read, and the more you practice and the more you get comfortable reading Arabic on a regular basis, the easier it's going to be for you to actually understand what you're reading without having to put through so much effort. So solutions, again, number 1, practice. So the more that you read, the faster you're going to move through these stages of reading, and you're going to advance, inshallah. So you're not going to be stuck on trying to remember where's the dhamma, where's the fatha, and do I say it this way or that way. Eventually you're going to get to the point where you can read very smoothly and focus on the meaning and not so much on the letters themselves. Another thing, again, that's very important is to have a teacher correct you. So this is what speech pathologists will do when they work with children who are trying to develop their reading skills. Speech pathologists will correct, right, mistakes that their clients make. So again, it's important to have a Quran teacher to correct you, because you might be making mistakes and not notice that you're making these mistakes. And then finally, again, what I think is really important, and one of my primary goals this whole presentation, is to know that these mistakes are normal, right? So there's nothing wrong with anybody if you make these mistakes. For Quran teachers, it's not because you're teaching improperly or because your student is so far behind. These mistakes are just a normal, natural process of being able to produce the sounds of the language correctly and to be able to read that language correctly. And then my last slide, here's my works cited, and so inshallah, I would love to open up to questions.
Thank you very much, Amanda Khanum. I appreciate Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, brother, sister, if you have any question or you have any comment.
The slide that you showed, the Allama and Alama, which one was the correct one?
Which is the correct one? So alam, right, is correct. Alam is wrong. And I picked that one actually because that's a mistake a lot of English speakers will make. The sound of ayn and the sound of alif will sound the same. A lot of English speakers will perceive both sounds as the equivalent to the letter A. And that's something I went through. So when I was learning Arabic and trying to read the Quran, everything sounded like I couldn't hear the difference. But it was through a great deal of listening and having a lot of teachers correct me that I was able to perceive the difference. And that's also a mistake that affects meaning, right? So if you add alam, right, and if you say alam, that's a completely different word in Arabic than alam. Any other questions? I hope. Yes, Dr. Misbahi.
To what degree do you think that knowing the language itself grammatically would help? You know, because I know many of the older generations in Iran, they're learning without knowing anything grammatically about the Arabic, but they're reading Hafiz by just repeating and repeating it. Sometimes not exactly correctly, but they manage it. So is there any connection between knowing the language scientifically or just reciting the Quran?
So I haven't seen, unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of very specific research on this specific question, right? There has yet to be a lot of research on Quran reciters and the cognitive process that they go through, but inshallah, I would love to see that one day. But based on research that I've seen on other populations, a dimension of comprehension is understanding of grammar, right? So if kids are having lots of problems in their grammar, they're also going to have problems in their reading comprehension. The difference, right, with Quran reciters and with people who memorize the Quran is often when they memorize an ayah of the Quran, they'll memorize its meaning at the same time, and along with it, its grammar. So they may understand, for example, because they've memorized the meaning or because they know enough of the words themselves that they can derive it, which is an excellent tool to have. but a very specific sort of translation, if they just read raw without necessarily knowing all that grammar, is going to be more challenging. So language study is definitely an important aspect, to be able to understand in a very accurate way without having to draw upon an internalization of a translation.
Most Persians, I think, maybe other too, they learn the language actually primarily through knowing the grammar. And they don't get any result in terms of speaking it or writing it. They just know the grammar, and I think that's sort of mentally is a major block.
So if you're only studying grammar, yeah, for sure, you're not going to get very far because there's a lot of dimensions to language. So language has 5 dimensions. There is the phonology of the language, the sounds of it, the semantics, which refers to the meaning of words, syntax, grammar, pragmatics, right, which refers to language use, how's its use, how is language used in specific contexts, and also lexicon, so it's just general vocabulary, right? So those are the 5 dimensions of language. The thing about Quran recitation, which makes it an interesting sort of thing to study, is that the language of the Quran isn't used in spoken speech anymore. So for example, the pragmatics of it, the use of it, what you say in certain social contexts really doesn't apply to when you're studying the Quran. But that's something, a process normally people will go through when they're studying the language. The semantics of things. So the way we learn semantics of words in Arabic is mostly through book study. So through studying not only translations of the Quran, but studying like Arabic tafsir of the Quran, studying Arabic dictionaries. So for example, Lisan al-Arab is what a lot of our ulama will use when they're studying the deeper meanings of the Quran. So there are some differences in Quran recitation and memorization from just regular language learning. But overall, if you work at it, if you try, there is a way to be able to understand the Quran properly, but it takes effort and it takes study. It's not something that's just going to come naturally.
How effective is atmospheric listening? That is, not careful listening, just completely just listening but doing other things.
Passive listening, like if you're just listening in the background.
I mean, I've heard a lot about that.
I haven't seen any specific research that talks about a comparison between passive and active listening. The way children will learn their mother tongue is not necessarily through engaging in active listening. It's a lot of passive listening that surrounds them. A very interesting thing that has even been found is that children actually hear their mother tongue when they're in the wombs of their mothers. And so there was a very fascinating study that was done on children who were born in China to Chinese parents, but then adopted by American parents and only spoke English growing up. And they studied their brains and they studied their response. They had them listen to Chinese, even though they did not know any Chinese. And what they found is that their brains lit up in response to the sounds of Chinese in the same way that other people's brains light up in response to the sounds of their mother tongue. So it's possible that that passive sort of listening, that sort of background is going to affect you. It's definitely a reason to have small children listening to the Quran from an early age. But in general, I haven't seen specific research on this specific topic. Again, it's under study. But a recommendation from Maulana Wahidi, the Quran reciter I mentioned before, is definitely active listening is going to be better. And for adults, as we're more active in the way that we learn, we can better handle details. A more active listening, reading at the same time, learning about the sounds and how to produce them is likely to be more effective.
Question. Could you elaborate on the accuracy of the Arabic being the most perfect language, and that's why the Quran is revealed in Arabic?
So from a linguistic perspective, there's no such thing as a most perfect language. And my understanding, even from a religious perspective, we don't necessarily say that Arabic is the most perfect language over all other language, but that Arabic was the most perfect language to have the Quran revealed in, that Arabic was the best language in terms of functionality, right? So the depth of the meaning of the words and the poetry of it made it the best language for the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to communicate to us. But from a linguistic perspective, there's nothing about a specific set of sounds or grammar patterns that necessarily makes one language better than another. A lot of times socially, right, what people would consider a language to be more important or better than another one is because of the function of the language, right? So we might consider Arabic to be a more important language to study because we use it for religious purposes. Another interesting thing to note is also about dialects, right? Languages in general will spread. It's normal for them to grow and change. Even during the Prophet's time, there were different dialects of Arabic. There was not one standard Arabic that people moved away from. So the Quran, the dialect that we use when we recite the Quran is Arabic as it was spoken in Mecca at the time that the Prophet was living. But there were other dialects of Arabic in other places. And so why that specific dialect was chosen, probably because that's where the Prophet lived and that's the way that he spoke, and it was the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But from a linguistic perspective, there's nothing about the sounds or the grammar that makes one necessarily inherently better than other languages. And another point that I like to make, even talking about accents within a language, as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of his signs was that he created our different languages, right? And sometimes one of the pitfalls that human beings will fall into is because if someone speaks a certain way, we'll assume negative things about them. So for example, people who speak with a southern accent in the United States will often be perceived as being less intelligent, right? But again, from a linguistic perspective, there's absolutely really no big difference between the sounds that they make and the words that they use than the sounds that are made in other regions. The only reason they're perceived that way and certain stereotypes get put on that accent is due to social and political factors. There's nothing inherently linguistic about the way people speak that makes it better or worse or really shows anything about a person's intelligence or character.
So interesting that many Arabs can't really read well.
Many Arabs cannot read well. And I've met many Arabs who unfortunately think because they are Arab, they can read well. And what ends up happening is they cut themselves off from a lot of knowledge that they could have taken if they were willing to learn and to understand that they also need to learn. The same thing, people shouldn't get discouraged. So this idea, and I hear this complaint all the time, Sister Amanda, I'm not Arab,